Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today we begin a three-part series in which we explore the idea of the subtle body, a concept found in many contemplative and healing traditions around the world. From yogic energy channels to Daoist internal alchemy, the subtle body refers to the layers of human experience that lie between the physical body and consciousness, suggesting that our lives may unfold through more dimensions than the purely material. In this episode, scholar and martial artist Simon Cox and myself interview Esalen co-founder Michael Murphy. Murphy was born in Salinas, California in 1930, making him a lively 95 years old at the time of this recording. He is a longtime student of Sri Aurobindo's integral philosophy and the author of numerous innovative books that approach the topic of the subtle body, including 1992's The Future of the Body and 1995's In the Zone. Throughout his career, Murphy has made it a priority to investigate extraordinary human capacities and the further evolution of human nature. Simon Cox brings a unique perspective to this conversation. Simon spent 6 years training in Daoist internal arts at Wudang Mountain in China before earning his PhD from Rice University. His book, The Subtle Body, A Genealogy, traces the history of subtle body concepts across cultures, and his research explores how these ideas have shaped both Eastern and Western spiritual traditions. He's currently a research fellow at Esalen's Center for Theory and Research.
Mike, we've been having these conversations since 2019. It was kind of when I was wrapping up my dissertation, and that you had some kind of corrections for the Esalen chapter. And that's where we really started to get into this topic of the subtle body. I started out with this quote from you, where you're just kind of framing the scope of this inquiry. So you said, what is the case? What is going on? Do we have a subtle body? Do we have several? Let's realize where we are in the greater scheme of this inquiry. So I think that's a really good place to start, just the massive scope of this problem and this project. So yeah, Mike, do you want to just kind of address this? Because this has been a recurring theme, is that people don't think large enough about this topic.
Right. Subtle bodies, even the title, even that term doesn't quite capture the range and depth of this issue, but let's use it. It gives us a good first handle. The first thing to say is that this issue, in its broader ramifications, has been coming up from the very first days of Esalen. Let's think about Fritz Perls. We're talking now 63, 64, 19. All right. He was analyzed by Wilhelm Reich. And he in Germany in the 30s. And Reich, had extended Freud's insights into the body itself. Psychosomatic symptoms, afflictions, and what he called character armoring. When you can see how we fight against, in his terms, the larger energies that are coming through us, sexual energies, aggressive energies, whatever.
Yeah.
But Freud, like virtually all of psychology in that time, was rooted in an atheistic philosophy. And were intent to show that their methods were, quote, scientific. So they didn't want to indulge in what we might call today woo-woo. No woo-woo here.
Yeah.
But their master in the Wilhelm Reich School began talking about orgone, what he called orgone, which is pretty close to what we are talking about with subtle body. It's an energy outside the flesh that's in play. And you can enhance it by getting into a contraption he devised called an orgone box.
Yeah.
Now you want woo-woo, he came straight out with his woo-woo. And okay, there was the orgone box. And then he speculated in some of his later conversations that the galaxies could be observed making love. You want, ooh, I mean, that's a good one. The galaxies making love. All right. So, okay, right from the, and now Fritz Perls actively campaigned to get rid of what he called the mystics and occultists, that Esalen had to grow up. And it didn't make his work look good to sitting in the middle of a bunch of woo-woo meisters, shamans and mystics and talking about this and that. So, okay, there was the issue of outside the flesh energies extending out into the universe and then entering into our bodies. And that is something that comes up a lot in conversations about what we're calling subtle bodies. Now, we move forward in time and all the way through with all the prime players' work, there is some way in which it enters in. Now, some of the very tough, hard materialists, say like B.F. Skinner, who came a few times to us, and he was a prominent materialist, operant conditioning and so forth. Now, he did not, to my knowledge, ever talk about such things, but he was, I would call it, he was an exception. Most of the teachers, whether they were psychologists or philosophers or theologians or anything else, tended to bring this up. Okay. Then, when we did address certain phenomena, like out-of-body experience, this came online kind of as Esalen was being founded. There were no such things really as near-death studies like have gone on at Virginia. Why? We didn't have the wherewithal, the means. You didn't have these extraordinary procedures that are central today to brain surgery or heart advanced surgery, where you have people under anesthetic for 6, 8 hours. And so more and more came these experiences that have been described now in several thousand case studies, many of which are probably in the biggest archive in existence at the University of Virginia, which has been headed for decades by Bruce Grayson, who's recently retired. And he's written about this. There's a big literature on this. People who claim when they're out under anesthetic to be floating around in an out-of-body state, a subtle body, observing the physical world. They can look down and it's been amazing, all of this literature. This is unarguable. The hardest materialists would grant that. They would say, yes, people have, but again, it's their experience. See, this is the big issue. And this is why some of us really feel Esalen has to now revisit and re-explore scientific method itself. Jeff Kripal and I talked about this at some length yesterday, that it's time now to get everybody aboard, and at least for us to at least pretend we're adults and try to talk about evidence in a clear, rational way. All right. So what do you do? Okay, somebody says they had this experience. Well, and you say back, well, that's your experience. Where's the evidence we have? We're scientists. Where's the publicly available evidence? Well, the first response is to see if there are other people having this experience. All right, so cutting right through to the end of this particular riff, we now have decades of this, decades. We have thousands of reports. We have hundreds of published case studies of people claiming to be in a condition in which they are under anesthetic They are unconscious, and in some cases, they appear to be possibly clinically dead in the sense that you have monitors on the brain and the heart, and that body is out of it. There's no doubt about it.
Mhm.
It's not only in the anecdotal report, it is in the evidence from EEGs and EMGs and so forth. Okay. So you have this ever developing body of evidence that you've acquired through different means. And science depends on it has to check reliably over time. And this is proven. And all along the way, you have people, not everyone, but a significant number of people reporting that they go into this state where they're floating around looking down. Now, okay. Now, we could go on and talk about other phenomena that have appeared in the 63 years since Esalen started its programs in 1962. The case has been building. Now, at the same time, along come scholars like you, Simon, who have explored this through reading ancient scriptures, living in temples like you did in Wudang Mountains, and so forth. So that's been supplementing our conversation about this. So it's not only from the Western traditions, from Christian or Jewish mystical reports and traditions, but it's from the East, from huge witness to this and discussions of it and naming of it, etc., in Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. So that's come online too. So you can argue that Esalen floats in an island that's just floating higher and higher up into these discussions. It comes to us, it surrounds us. You can't get rid of it. So if you were looking for analogies in mainstream science, let's say in the development of physics and cosmology, okay, we can start with Copernicus. All right. Copernicus left this model that he thought demonstrates clearly that we revolve around the sun. The sun doesn't revolve around us. But the church suppressed it. And Galileo famously was suppressed. But fortunately, the Pope who took him on hardest had been his classmate in school in Florence. It wasn't enough for them to have Thomas Aquinas and all the arguments for God from that point of view. They had to have their physical model in place that we humans are on a very divine planet chosen by God's Son, Jesus Christ, to possibly have redemption. But God and his Son can't redeem a planet filled with people who believe crazy things, that this is not a special place around which the sun revolves. This is the way they talked. And it's not that long ago. I mean, this is 500 years ago, 600 years ago. Okay. But what happened? The evidence piled up, and this has been going on now for these hundreds of years. And at some point, it just cracked and fell apart, the old synthesis. Meanwhile, persons had been burnt at the stake, Bruno and all of this. All right, we now, today, with our projects that we're trying to develop, are in a way mirroring that kind of evolution. We're flying, okay, not into the opposition of the Catholic Church, but into the mainstream reductive materialism or physicalism that many scientists and humanists embrace. We're against the worldview. All right, but then we have a second problem. And this is very important for Esalen. Not only do we have parts of the culture dead set against exploring, let's say, subtle energies and subtle bodies and so forth, But we have some of our friends who have very diminished views of this as well. So their way in is not what we could call science, it's just assertion, typically based on a guru of some sort or a body worker who's become a guru and says, this is the way it is. And we went through one of the most famous incidents of this kind because they came up with something called Kirlian photography, which turned out to be eventually bogus. That what is being photographed is not the subtle body, but the ionized perspiration that bodies emit and other substances. But if you get a straight line shot in a certain light or in a certain circumstance, it looks like an aura that's been painted in all these religious pictures. And we got involved in this through our stuff with the Russians and the East Europeans who were developing Kirlian photography. Well, later it was debunked. And so we admitted it. We were barking up the wrong tree. We were photographing the wrong sweat or whatever. So many of physicists hear these claims about Kirlian photography, and they say, see, there goes those Esalen people again, chasing the latest woo-woo. And so it doesn't help. So we have to have a sophistication to meet the challenge. And the challenge is on many fronts. There are different aspects of the challenge, which I suppose we need to explore going forward with this series of programs.
That's great, Mike. Thanks. Yeah, you jumped right to our methodological stance that we're engaging in this kind of broad comparative inquiry. And then from there, you moved to actually our next item on the list, which was kind of pitfalls to avoid, which was the stuff about Kirlian photography in the 1970s and the kind of the presence of gurus, whether they're actual spiritual gurus or even kind of scientific gurus. There's the same morphology of worship of kind of individual personalities that can steer and kind of constrain entire fields of inquiry.
That's beautifully said, Simon. And of course, Esalen, when we were founded, when I started to dream this up, it was in the 1950s, and I was actually in India then, in an Indian ashram of a great philosopher, Sri Aurobindo goes, who'd also been an Indian independence leader and had also been educated for 14 years from the time he was 7 till he was 21 in England at St. Paul's School and then at King's College, Cambridge. He had the best English education. His father was kind of to the intellectual royalty of India, and he was an atheistic doctor himself. And these were Indian families who really wanted to be modern people and bring science together with the best in Indian philosophy. And Aurobindo was like that. Anyway, then he became an independence leader. He was one of the first 3 or 4 Indians who, before Gandhi, called for complete independence from Great Britain, not Commonwealth status. They wanted complete independence, like the Irish were fighting for, and like colonies, I mean, different countries around the world. The British Empire, at one point, the largest empire in world history, controlled 1/4 of all the land in the world. And as these were fighting for their freedom, Aurobindo was one of the leaders. All right, I was in that ashram, and it was the first primary influence on me that led me away from what I thought I was going to do with my life, what my parents wanted me to do. And it was shocking to them to become not a doctor, not a psychiatrist, but a yogi, which, as my father asked me, son, if it could have been anything else, it would have been all right. But a yogi, what does a yogi do? More than just sit there on a bed of nails, I hope. Anyway, later he was our number one supporter. He was fantastic, my father, and they all were, but they had to get over the shock of age of 25 was in this Indian ashram. Now, it was a great place, and it was a great place for me to anchor a reading of my intellectual address to these things. But I got a full dose of cult-like behavior. Now, I would call it an upper cult. It was very sophisticated. They attracted a lot of very wealthy types. You'd have to say good families. So many of these kids were to the manor born. And there was a great school there. They learned languages. They're very cultivated people. But these cult-like projections and ideas, and I was amazed that people like this, so warm, so developed, good people, could get these weird ideas about the teachers there themselves, Sri Aurobindo and his female colleague, whom they in the Indian manner called the mother. She was a French national, genetically Jewish, culturally kind of global. She was an extraordinary lady, no doubt about it, but she believed fervently in various assertions that not only Aurobindo himself made about this and that, but what other leading members of the Indian elites believed. And some of it was just too much for me. And the assertions that she was of a higher sort. Now, this idea you can't get away with as much anymore, but back then, that she saw things we couldn't see. She had powers that we didn't have. But I was thrown into the middle of a situation where an American lady had a psychotic break and ended up trying to kill herself over there. And the mother herself turned to me to help. And I would have these one-on-one conversations with her, the mother, she at that point was in her 70s, but she wore makeup. I'd see her in the morning without makeup. She looked very different, and she was very earthy and straightforward with me. And so I was seeing two people. One was the one who stood in front of the crowd, looking like some sort of supernatural being and held like that. Then somebody down to earth talking straight about this lady and what had precipitated her psychotic break, which had been actually when one of our mutual friends from the States was over there. I got mumps when I was right in the ashram at first, so they put me in quarantine. And when I was in quarantine, this friend of ours came and they had a fling, he and this lady. This lady was a little older than us. We were 25. She probably was 38, maybe 40. And it really knocked her for a loop and she flipped. So the first thing the mother said, she said and we talked about this, and the earthiest, just the way you and I would. I mean, it's completely earthy and down to earth. All right. But if I told some of the other ashramites about the conversation, they didn't believe me. They said, well, you misheard her. She couldn't have said that. She couldn't have said that Stephanie and Rob slept together. She couldn't have said that. She's the Divine Mother. I said, well, I'm sorry. I mean, it's what we did talk about. So this started to precipitate a number of encounters, and it felt like dominoes. My perception of what was going on held together as if by Scotch tape on a bunch of projective myths of the mother and Sri Aurobindo. Aurobindo had died by then, but she was the essential glue that was holding the whole thing together. And then it set me on a course, which led me, and then Dick Price and he went through his own experiences with the cult of then psychiatry when he was put into a mental hospital by his family when he had a kind of flip out when he was in the Air Force in an ecstatic state. In those days, you could not have these altered states in public. Now, he did have it in an unfortunate part of the public, the Air Force. The Air Force is not a place to be in ecstatic states and running around, etc. And they put him in the brig. And his father, who was running Sears Roebuck, the big department chain, was friends with the Secretary of War in the cabinet. And the Secretary of War, for his friend, got Dick a honorable discharge on condition that they deal with this flip out as a psychotic break, not as some sort of religious experience. So that's where he ended up in the Institute for Living, the most high-end mental hospital. Or you may have seen that movie, A Beautiful Mind, about the famous mathematician Nash, who was in that hospital. He'd had his flip out. And so anyway, Dick and I, in our separate ways, came to this commitment against cult. All right. And that we have learned through the decades, the same psychodynamics can operate in scientific circles, it can political circles. I mean, people are critical now of the MAGA followers of Donald Trump. It has cult-like aspects. What about this group? There is a group of people whose mission is to be able to touch him physically. So they come up to him and all they want to do is put their hands and touch him. I saw him interviewed on this once and said, "Why do people need to touch you?" And I could tell he really liked being touched. But he said, "I don't understand it. I don't, but they need to touch me physically." Well, you could name a couple of dozen items like that are just like these cults that exist in religious settings and around certain psychological gurus and so forth. Okay, now, at some point, I think, Simon, we're going to, and we should, in a more detailed way, and embracing this vast literature on this, the authoritarian personality, a lot of it really took off and was developed because of the Holocaust. And I was immersed in that literature alongside the literature that led me directly to the quest for the greater consciousness and everything that comes out of this at Esalen. But this cult behavior literature is quite substantial. And to go back into that and to look at it as it inhibits us when some of our friends form a group, let's say around Kirlian photography or whatever, and then insist that it's real. This is not the way we operate. We do not relitigate long lost causes. And that's another thing. You know, there's been so much discussion at Esalen in the CTR formats. Say, for example, is telepathy real? Well, this has been going on now actually for 100 years, ever since the word was invented by Frederick Myers back in the 1880s. And there's no doubt anymore. So we're wasting people's time, money, and all our energies to go have to do it again. We did it already. Okay, the same with Kirlian photography. And it's the same with a lot of stuff that has come at us because of subtle bodies. So I think we've got to take seriously that we've got problems close at home and even within the Esalen community of just not being deeply enough anchored in real scientific inquiry. And not only that, how people learn to do workarounds to prove that something that doesn't work works. This is another, oh boy, this is another thing that we have to deal with. Cult. Okay, authoritarian belief systems. It has to be susceptible to proof. And we see what happens, say, with the MAGA cult around Trump. We see what happens in even a place that was born out of a great mind and a great body of people like the Aurobindo ashram. I honor them, but I wish they could get rid of some of this cult-like fringe. I would say they're not like Scientology. Now, Scientology, that's a tough cult. That really is. Again, doing some good things, but then rough as hell on you if you're a member and you don't buy what L. Ron Hubbard says. Okay,
Michael, if I may break in here, just with a quick question. You talk about the importance of Esalen sort of bringing up this scientific inquiry. How do you kind of marry that with the interest in something like subtle bodies, which may be more difficult to apprehend within something like the scientific method? I mean, when I think about subtle bodies, it seems like there's going to be sort of like leap of faith at some level with subtle bodies if you're going to take advantage of all that that has to offer. How does that sort of fit with an increased interest in scientific?
That's the challenge ahead of us. That's what this needs. Our conversation should address that. That's the $64 question, as they used to say. It's okay. Now that's a whole other section, and we're going to have to find ways to do it. And it would be, a lot of people would tell us, well, this is a very brave thing you guys are doing, because we're refusing to go down easy for these so far failed answers. Now, obviously, there's some immediate things I could say, but I think, Simon, that question is so basic and it deserves its own uh, ordering of that. All right, how? The big how.
Well, yeah, thanks, Sam. That's a perfect framing question. And it really, I think, ties into actually what Mike was just talking about, which is something we've talked a lot about, which is this kind of early days kind of Esalen as a freedom fighter. It's a kind of ideology of no one captures the flag, right? Which is kind of the contemporary tagline of Esalen. And that's where the kind of Esalen was this experimental ground for different forms of consciousness exploration and studies beginning in 62. But because Mike and Dick and you guys had this very kind of like no one captures the flag ethos, you weren't willing to establish a central kind of taxonomy of like the official Esalen chakra map or the Esalen subtle body or whatever. And so you just let all of these different kind of gurus come and go, and you had this real kind of like creative soup of exploration. So this has good parts to it and also kind of bad parts to it. And so, Mike, you've used this term a lot, Tower of Babel, to talk about how Esalen was this sort of like subtle body Tower of Babel. Everybody's speaking a different language. But then through that, people formulate these kind of pigeon vocabularies for speaking across divides in disciplines, from scientists speaking with mystics, kind of in cooler cases. And so at the same time, Esalen, you had this Mike, we talked about how you were influenced by Theodore Adorno, the authoritarian personality back in the 50s. And so you really didn't want to have these kind of hierarchical structures just like kind of bearing down on people. But at the same time, that can prevent further exploration of topics if things are a little too anarchical. And so this is this is the central tension of the subtle body question. How do you pursue this thing scientifically while still preserving this really open spirit?
All right. How do you go about this inquiry? All right. One way is to take some of the methods directly from mainstream science. Now, I've done that through first what we then called back in the 70s the Transformation Project, which was to collect scientific studies, scholarly studies from many fields about supernormal human functioning. And we eventually had 10,000 such studies. John Vasconcellos, who was in the California State Legislature, had gotten California money, state funds, to fund a big archive at University of California, Santa Barbara. And all of these papers that we had collected are down there now in hard copy with keywords. There are about 250 keywords. So you can say you want to look at stigmata, these marks that are induced psychophysically. Say in the Catholic Church, St. Francis of Assisi, the wounds of Christ that appeared on his body. And then pretty soon there were more than 200 of these stigmatics across Europe within 100 years. It's kind of like when Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile thing. The next guy broke it 5 weeks later, and pretty soon everybody was breaking 4 minutes. And before that, nobody could. Well, the same with stigmata. It was imitated. And okay, so you can go down in those archives, and then you can say Christian stigmata, then Islamic stigmata. These are Muslims who have the battle wounds of Muhammad. So instead of the wounds of Christ, they're the battle wounds of Muhammad. Or you can have what they're called psychological or psychodynamic stigmata, where in therapy, a woman remembers being beaten by her father or uncle or someone with a cane that had on its end a knob of the cane on which was carved a death's head. And so what appeared in her catharsis in front of her analyst was a stigmata of that death's head. And this was published in The Lancet, the most prestigious British medical magazine. So anyway, you can go down there, and in this archive, you can find that. All right. Out of all of that, I began to then say what I was doing was a form of what used to be called natural history, if you go back in the West. And that's when you just went out and collected things. And you could be collecting descriptions, at least, of animals that nobody had ever seen before. So in the early 17th century, back around the early 1600s, they're going down to the Serengeti Desert. Nobody had seen a zebra, apparently. And here was them coming back. There are horses there that have stripes. And then, there's a thing with a long neck, a giraffe. And this was news to the world. Okay. Point I'm making is that natural history, okay, you can collect rocks. You can collect sightings in the sky, comets. And then they had better and better telescopes. They could see. All right, natural history. You collect evidence. That's what it is. You collect evidence. All right. Now, that's one thing we need to do. Simon, this conference we're putting together for next year on materialization. Okay, materialization. But we have to go around collecting. There's a lot of materialization evidence that we don't know about. So there are many kinds of this. And along the way, you find a lot of cheating, like in the Society of Psychical Research during these seances, where the mediums would fake a ghost. And they were very creative about this, how out of cheesecloth, you can drape something in such a way that in a light, it looks ghost-like and floats around. Then they snatch it away, hide it under the sofa or whatever. And so they debunked a lot of, so the debunking, as you've pointed out, Simon, to me, that helps develop our chops in the eyes of the world. Look, these guys, they're debunking stuff too. So not only do we collect evidence, one of my favorite stories is that the English Royal Society, and a lot of the English, either secretly or not, look down on the Irish. They do. So anyway, these reports were coming in about these incredible animals down in so one of the set of reports were dismissed because the so-called anthropologists were Irish. And they said, well, the Irish, first, they drink on the job. And secondly, they're always embellish. An Irishman has to embellish his story. Now, there is a tendency among the Irish, I have enough Irish in me to know, I have the tendency myself, at times to color up the story. So in other words, it was a fight to get some of the data out on the table. Now, that's what we have to, one of the first things we can do, if we did nothing else, but we really frame this over, say, a 2 or 3 year period, look at how robust this field of evidence is. That's number one. Okay, now, what comes out of that as the standard next step is a taxonomy. What Gregory Basin, you start to see the patterns that connect this one from that one. And taxonomies go way back. Even Aristotle, when he started to write, he was 2,000 years ahead of the curve, say, with mollusks. And he identified that these different creatures, whether they were oysters or clams or shrimps or whatever, they all had this hard shell. So anyway, there was some way to distinguish. Now, we among ourselves, Simon, I would argue, have kind of blindly, like sleepwalkers, started collecting enough right now that at one conference we could mobilize quite a little effort to get several thousand phenomena out on the table, get it recorded and all this, and start to say what a taxonomy of subtle body type evidence is out there. So that would be step number two. I mean, first you're collecting. Secondly, you're sorting it out. This is what Tanya Luhrmann wants to do on her various things. And it's what I've done in a big book, The Future of the Body. I ended up making the move I made was to say that, and I chose 12 sets of human attributes. Perception of the outer world would be one, kinesthesis would be another, communication abilities would be another. And all right, all of these attributes have been inherited from our animal ancestors, but all of them give rise to quite a variety of supernormal somethings, structures, activities, etc. So that's the move I made in the future of the body. It's not that hard to do. So I see that as an inevitable necessity for us to push. But I don't know anyone, and you and I have thought about this and talked about it. The people who've gone the furthest among them, the SPR, and you, Simon, created this bot. All 37,000 pages of their journals between their founding in 1884 all the way up into whenever it is, the 20s or 30s, you've got in the bot. And so, when you went after some of this stuff, took you about 15 minutes to get this stuff we would have been looking around for months. That's what you can do with these goddamn AI. Typically, what happens in any field, whether it's in the physical sciences, like geology and astronomy and cosmology itself and astrophysics, that's, let's say, the inanimate. Then you have the life sciences, biology and ethology and et cetera, you start to get models of what's going on. And most models are eventually busted. They're not right, but they're at least first attempts. And you can do them. But Einstein, who was one of the all-time champions at these models, Gedanken experiments, and see what that model gives you. And then if it's really robust enough, you can develop a theory, like Newton. And sometimes the theory works and you have an Isaac Newton and the world changes. Or you have Einstein with the special theory, E equals mc squared, you have an atom bomb. Or you have his general theory, and that lets you see, oh my God, there are these black holes. Einstein never had an image of a black hole. In other words, the theory gives you more than it, you get a huge return on investment from the theory. So we would have to go down that path, it seems to me. And I don't think there will be other shortcuts proposed. I know that. For example, one that's always proposed, you get the most developed person that we can find who exhibits these phenomena. Well, great. If you get it, let's get it. But I would put that back in the evidence phase, but we have to get enough of this out on the table. So to be big enough to meet the challenge of this giant question. First of all, is there such a thing as the subtle energy? I think we have enough evidence that yes, we probably do. And then another step would be certain models. Let's say the thing, Simon, we need to talk more about this. The Taittiriya Upanishad, the idea of the five bodies, it's so endemic in the modern world from different fields. We have a pranamaya kosha, that is a vital body, and then we have a manomaya kosha, that whole model. Then that would have to be critiqued over time. That's something I think about quite a bit. So that will have to go on, that we'll have to will have to go through what the physical sciences, the life sciences, and it's been very hard for the human sciences, psychology, anthropology, sociology. It's hard for us to do it because people want to lock in right away for therapeutic reasons or spiritual reasons. So you're not doing science anymore. You're just quickly doing applied science. You can say we're doing therapy or whatever, or as is happening now with my little specialty in the sports world, these sports teams. And they have to deal with some of these star athletes who have freaking out experiences. I have so many, I've collected, where I could say I've done a little of my own science collecting these stories of these athletes that never get in the newspapers. Sports writers don't know. Sports writers are typically failed novels, and they debunking everything. It's a cynical group. I've met a lot of them. I mean, God, cynical. I mean, they're jealous of the athletes. They're jealous of the writers. They float along, and they get to write about these athletes, and then they hear how, as they say, the dumb jocks. How these jocks are dumber than I thought. This is a sports guy talking to me. And so this is not where science starts among sports writers. They don't even describe the phenomena. And the American public, the world public, loves sport. And they would be dazzled to hear some of the stories I get to hear just because I wrote that one book, Golf in the Kingdom, and the people read it. You have a Serengeti on the sport fields. I mean, these stories are just amazing. And they never get told because the athlete's afraid to look like an idiot. The coaches and all are trying to talk him out of it because they think he's doing bad things because of these crazy experiences. You've heard me talk about some of these stories. I don't know, Sam, if you have talked much about some of these stories, but I mean, it's unbelievable. This thing about when you get a data set and you start identifying big mistakes. For example, this thing with those seances where they were cheating. Okay, once you can eliminate the cheating, it can focus your mind wonderfully, and you can suddenly you can see the data better. And for example, right now, Jeff and I talked about this quite a bit yesterday with UFOs. Once you can just get the field, no more of this bullshit that the government is hiding the corpses of aliens or that it's got this or that. It's not right. That's bullshit. We've been at this now since the 1940s. And in Washington, they gossip all the time. And to think that for 100 years they've been hiding this, it is bullshit. Okay, once you take that away, you're left with these experiences like happened at Esalen recently, where all these 20 people saw these goddamn things. I mean, we got 20 witnesses there. So it's like there's a Serengeti in the sky. A Serengeti in the sky. We can look at, and then we start to say, what's the difference between this one and that one? And a study of that has not yet been done. Can you believe that? A comparative study of the different kinds. Oh, now, see, that's the problem. They then say, all right, it's a spacecraft. And then you have Steven Spielberg make these great movies like E.T. and all this. And then everybody says, well, look, they're making movies about this already. But the movies are based on this assumption that blah, blah, blah. You see what I mean? If you can go naked into the data and just ruthlessly honest, this is what's going on. Well, we don't know. Something's happening. What happened at Esalen to cause that? The guy stood out there. Mac Murphy, my son was there. There were about 15 people, and they saw these little lights. Sam, have you heard about this thing at Esalen? Well, it was the group. They had a group down there. They took over the property, and so they're rich guys, and they had these wonderful things, and so there they were. I don't know how many were actually there. There were 60 or 70 people, but anyway, so this one guy, rich, and there was paying for this thing. And I'm just telling you the story. I'm just telling you because I've heard it now from several people. So this one night, there were about 20 of them up by the swimming pool. So they see on the horizon these kind of lights like rising and floating up and down. And he went out and went through his summoning the goddamn things, calling them as if he was a shaman. And by God, all I'm being is the reporter. They started to come closer, closer and closer, and everybody was alarmed. I mean, they were coming in under the cliff, and suddenly it stopped. But there were another 10 people down in the baths. And unbeknownst to the group up by the pool, they reported that these lights came into the tubs where they were. And nothing happened. They just dissolved all around them in the tubs. And you can get the stories. And now the point is, you had 30 people observing this phenomenon. All right, what is it? Now the guy that summoned them said, well, those were the flying saucers. But well, they could tell you, well, there were these lights. So he was not a very good anthropologist, not a very good scientist. He summoned these damn lights and then said, oh, those are the real thing. But that doesn't give you any information. And that's what happens. So now you can relate it to some of the religious phenomena, like the Fatima and, some of Jeff's books. And I had some in Future of the Body. I mean, there are these phenomena. We could go into the Catholic records about these and so forth. But you see what I mean? Now, in the sport world, these guys have a hard time listening to these athletes. In other words, it's hard to maintain the phenomena unless you're a trained scientist. And now the thing is, in the early years of the Serengeti, these guys, finally enough people got down there. So by God, there are zebras, there are giraffes. So you had enough people saying, well, my God, there are. But in our realm, it's tougher because they're fleeting phenomena. They're harder to capture. And then when a wide receiver, one of my favorite stories, he made this play that just blew everybody's mind. He went up for a ball. He jumped higher than any of them thought he could jump. But the cornerback was under him and hit one of those tackles where then he falls backwards and fell right on his neck. And so after the thing was over, and he held the ball after the thing, and they said, now look, you can never do that again. It's lucky you're not a paraplegic. And we're just not in this business to produce paraplegics. Please never do that again. He said, well, I was safe. He said, then they show him the movie. You're not safe. When you came down, you landed on your neck. He said, well, I didn't really. And he said, well, look, there it is, right there. He said, oh, well, you're not filming me. You were, and now here's where he gets into trouble. You are filming what a camera gives you. And so he says, well, it only gives you part of the story. That there's more to my body than that. I mean, for example, you know why I caught it, don't you? I had 7 fingers. So they said, now, Paul, look, we like your metaphors. You should be a writer. But look, we're going to count your fingers. Of course, they couldn't because it was too far away on the camera. But he says, I had 7 fingers. And he says, well, no, you have 5 fingers. He says, you can't see all my body. He says that. Now, right there, he's in trouble with his trainers and a couple of assistant coaches around him. Now, I collect these stories. They're trying to describe something that is discussed in the martial arts, but not in the NFL. You see what I mean? So even in mainstream sport, on television, seen by the American public, celebrated if your team wins, et cetera, et cetera. And this story goes on, and we don't even see it. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the central reason we have an Esalen. It's because we don't see one another. See, we don't. And this goes on all the time. We see enough to get along. We don't feel or see, but I get enough of this to know. And we got this from day one. People saying, I'm having experiences here, and why? We give permission. So now it's writ large in the world at large, and particularly in people who go outside the box, like NFL players, or get assaulted by something they think is a UFO, or let's say making love. So that's our world. We're waking up, we're trying to wake up to who the fuck we really are. Now we're going down to the basic questions. Well, onward.
Well, thanks, Mike. Yeah, so that was all precipitated, I think, by Sam, your question about like how do we do this, right?
Yeah, I like that. I like that how you are grounding what are some inquiries that can be harder for many folks to pin down. You're grounding it in the material world in a certain sense.
Yeah, I would say maybe also that we're grounding it in the world we can, as rational folks, share. And it's the stories we tell each other. And we have to ground it in that. How do we talk about this stuff? It often involves phenomena that are not strictly physical. They're, you would have to say spiritual or emotional, or they exist or happen in another dimension, as it were, or in another body. See, now we get into the models of the Taittiriya Upanishad, that we have 4 or 5 bodies. We're like, what do you call those? These eggs, those Petrushka dolls in Russia, or one within another within another. So it's as if we have these subtle bodies, and we all have them, but the flesh, this body in the Taittiriya Upanishad would be the Annamaya Kosha. That's the one we are in now, talking to each other.
Yeah, and yeah, coming from a kind of historical angle, which is how I approached all of this stuff initially, the way you frame it is helpful for me, Mike, because you frame it in terms of the history of science, and always with an appeal back to like you're always mentioning we're at the kind of earliest innings of this kind of inquiry. So when
Yeah.
people think about science, we think about the very mature sciences of the
Right,
21st century of CERN and biopharmaceutical labs that are very
right,
sophisticated. But we don't think back to people just kind of like
right.
gathering random facts, which is what was really happening in back in the 17th century into the 18th
Yeah,
century, and how we have to
yeah,
start there with this kind of inquiry, right?
yeah. We were all, well, we've got to be faced. We're in the early innings of all this. And of course, that's been an obstacle at Esalen because gurus come and we have the testimony of the great ancient religions and the authority of this or that great authority. And they're in the early innings too. Everyone, humans generally. And then we have the compounding, now biblical criticism. I mean, there was a Jesus Christ, but it's pretty well established now. He was illiterate. He did almost certainly was some sort of craftsman, carpenter, and his disciples, not Paul, but his disciples were illiterate too. And they formed a cult. And this latest book, by Dale Allison, and that we will really want to involve in this thing, he's first rate. The experiences they reported, if you take away this idea that it's God's son, if you can just say he was this guy, he's taken all the so-called miracles and correlated them with commonly observed psychic experiences people have today. I mean, our domain of the paranormal, the supernormal. So once you put them in, he did the opposite of what Thomas Jefferson did. See, Thomas Jefferson took all the miracles out. So, and just left his good works and his good moral authority. But Dale's done the opposite. He's kept the miracles, but he's put a parapsychology analogies in. So you keep them like Pentecost. That there have been a lot of Pentecosts that have been, some of us have been in our own little Pentecost. In other words, when the divine spirit, as it were, however you experience it, comes into at some of these rock and roll concerts, some of the stories you hear. I mean, really, they have their own little and it might be at Woodstock or somewhere that goes on, and 100 of them are in this ecstasy. And these stories, you have to go out there and get these stories. Taylor Swift, I mean, if she wanted to be a guru, people would say, yeah, I had an experience. I was out of my body there the other day in her concert. And she says, well, now you all who go out of your body, this is what we do. Let's say if she thought she was a shaman and she could really develop a following that way. Of course, she'd be debunked, but that would just add to it then. It's like the more you debunk someone, like you debunk Donald Trump, and now, oh, everybody's saying, see, I can't take it when someone will say, well, he's Jesus all over again, Donald Trump. And there are people who say it. MAGA, they believe. They believe. It's so humans, we're still, we're barely stood up straight. I mean, we're down on all fours a million years ago. We're we're, we're just starting to stand up straight. Oh God.
Yeah, cool.
Forgive
It's,
forgive
it's
me.
it. No,
We've got
it's good stuff, Mike.
yeah, we got to face it where we are.
I feel like we've really gotten actually to some really fundamental points regarding Esalen, like well, way beyond the subtle body inquiry. But the earlier when you were talking about Esalen being about just like seeing each other, but you were actually talking about actually kind of seeing each other's subtle bodies. Well, it was in the context of that kind of little vignette about the football player who has seven fingers,
Yeah,
right?
right.
You've talked about this before about this is another thing actually your old mentor Frederick Spiegelberg used to talk about the subtle body in these terms. And when someone's saying like I'm all bent out of shape, that's not your physical body, right? You're talking about it's something else.
Right, the Sukshma and the Sthula Sharira and the Sukshma. So he was representing the sophisticated science of the day when he was educated, the 1920s, and you into phenomenology. That was one of the directions where okay, you're really examining your experience, and see that's legitimate in mainstream science. Freud, it's all of psychology. But it's not making any of these grand metaphysical claims. And but of course, I am anchored in a metaphysical claim that evolution is laboring to give rise to a further development. That's the claim. But I mean, I was very clear about all that stuff in the future of the body. This is there, but I'm not putting it forth as a religious dogma. I'm just putting it on the basis of evolution does happen. Evolution is comprised of many facts, but there have been many different theories related to evolution. But, well, natural selection would no longer be considered a mere theory. I mean, it happens. It's true. Darwin was right. Okay. But the claims of, say, the German idealists like Schelling, the Deus implicitus in the course of time is becoming the Deus explicitus. All right, that's a metaphysical claim. I buy it myself. It's because I do think what's coiled up inside us comes out in these experiences. And that's where the yogis, or that's the high metaphysicians like Plotinus or Shankara or whomever, match up to these experiences that people who are naive about all that relate.
Mhm.
These athletes, I mean, it's so obvious once you get into the data. It's just, but people don't do it. They don't go there. They don't get to be in the locker room when a guy's saying he has seven fingers. I've been lucky. And through this book I wrote, Golf in the Kingdom, that's what opened the door for me 53 years ago.
I treated the development of your corpus in my book on my Esalen chapter, and I read about yeah, it's 72, right? Was golf in the kingdom, and so
Right.
you were like 40, 41, 42 years old.
Well, when it was published, I was 41,
Hmm.
going on 42. I
Yeah.
started writing it when I was 39,
Hmm.
and I'd never tried to write until then. My brother had published a book he wrote when he was 23. He was the designated writer in the family. I was
Yeah.
supposed to be a doctor,
Hmm.
but I turned out to be a yogi father. I didn't call myself a yogi, but he saw me as a yogi, and he wondered if a yogi ever does anything. Are you going to go to work, son, any day? Oh, I support myself as when I was a gardener in the early years and
Huh.
wait on tables.
Huh.
Now, he didn't want to say, well, that's kind of disappointing that our son, he had a scholarship to Harvard and you turn out to be waiting on tables. Well, okay. My parents were fabulous, though. God, how they put up with me. And and then I choose as a buddy a guy who'd been in a mental hospital. So that didn't encourage them either. But it did encourage them that the friend of the father, his father was Secretary of War. Well, that was very impressive.
Yeah.
But then they commiserated with him too. So we had to put up with these two lunatics. Anyway, huh,
You have a kind of a list of superpower of cities at the end of Golf in the Kingdom, kind of superpowers that are developed through this kind of mystical uh, discipline, right? But I
well,
mean, the whole thing has this kind of, I think Jeff Kripal has characterized it as a form of mystical realism, right?
yeah, mystical
So
realism.
there's a kind of tongue-in-cheek quality, also maybe this kind of Celtic Irish flavor you bring to the
Oh
table,
yeah,
but behind the whole thing. But then you do kind of lay your cards on the table in the 90s, right, when you publish Future of the Body, where
right,
it's the tongue is out of the cheek and the kind of Celtic madness is kind of set aside, and you just present this massive tome full of thousands of case studies, right? So
right.
kind of articulating these things.
Well, I travel under two passports. One was Golf in the Kingdom, and one's Esalen. I mean, okay, there will be people who will say to me, I know they will, well, you're choosing a very lightweight way to have your story told. I said, well, listen, I'll take whatever I can get. But but also it's a marvelous door to come through because it's based in real events, backed up by endless testimony. The book has been out there. That's why it's a million copies. Why? Because people have these experiences, period. It's endemic. And to explain it merely as being in the zone, that tells you something, but it's a very thin description, right? I was in
Yeah.
the zone. All right. All right. And now it's a signal to one another. Yes, there is something and it is different. You're in a different space. You feel different and everything. But for a long time, I was saying the problem with that is there's so many different kinds of zone. You're in a zone. It would be a more precise way if you were a more ambitious anthropologist. I was in a zone. Okay, a zone. And what is a zone? Then you could have to characterize the state of consciousness, the different set of feelings, these supernormal behaviors. How do they do? Where does this energy come from? Why do they say that time slows down? Why do they say they had seven fingers? Why do they? I mean, it goes on and on and on. You're a different person. Well, it begins to sound like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. You've had a religious conversion. People have said that to me, and people have volunteered that. And I'd say, yes, it's similar in that it's a whole person response. What do you mean by a whole person? It's more than just your flesh. You experience in other dimensions. They say this. And these are guys. One of the interesting things is so many of the NBA and NFL have never heard of Plotinus or the issue of Upanishad or the Taittiriya Upanishad. What's that? So they're looking for metaphors. They're looking for language. So this gives them a language. Right on the book itself, the latest edition, you have a testimony from a couple of the top pros saying, I always thought this was there, but never had the language for it. So they claim, and no problem, that I gave them a language to talk about this stuff.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show was produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. It was edited by Simon Cox. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. Until next time, be well.